The strategic trap waiting in Venezuela. Let me take you back to March 18 of this year, a date that barely registered in the Western press, but one that should have set off alarm bells in every strategic studies department from Washington to Beijing. That was the day Venezuela's National Assembly, controlled by Nicolas Maduro's government, passed a law authorizing the creation of a new special economic zone in the disputed Essequibo region, a territory that Guyana claims as its own and that ExxonMobil has been aggressively drilling in for nearly a decade. The law didn't just assert Venezuelan sovereignty over Essequibo, it explicitly banned any foreign military presence in the zone, a direct shot across the bow at both Guyana and its primary backer, the United States. Now, most media outlets covered this as a predictable escalation in a long-running territorial dispute, another chapter in the tired narrative of Maduro's authoritarianism and Venezuela's economic collapse. But that's not what this is. What we're watching unfold is something far more: a carefully constructed geopolitical tripwire, one that could drag the United States into a conflict it doesn't want, doesn't need, and most critically, cannot win without triggering a chain reaction that reshapes the global order. I've spent the last 3 decades studying how great powers stumble into wars they later regret, and what's happening in Venezuela right now has all the hallmarks of a classic strategic trap. The question isn't whether the US will step into it, but when and how badly it will hurt when it does. Let me tell you what they're not telling you. The official narrative on Venezuela is so well worn at this point that it barely needs repeating. Since Hugo Chávez's death in 2013, we've been told that Venezuela is a failed state, a narco-dictatorship propped up by Russian mercenaries and Iranian drones, a threat to regional stability, and most recently, a potential staging ground for Chinese military action in the Western Hemisphere. The US government's position has been Maduro is an illegitimate leader, his 2018 re-election was fraudulent, and the only path forward is his removal, whether through sanctions, diplomatic isolation, or, if necessary, military pressure. The Trump administration recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president in 2019, a move the Biden administration has walked back but not entirely abandoned. The State Department's 2023 country reports on human rights practices describes Venezuela as a corrupt, authoritarian regime that systematically violated human rights, while the Pentagon's 2022 National Defense Strategy lists Venezuela as a persistent challenge alongside Iran and North Korea. The data seems to support this. Venezuela's economy has contracted by more than 75% since 2013, inflation hit 1 million% in 2018, and over 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country, one of the largest refugee crises in the world. The US has imposed crippling sanctions, including a ban on Venezuelan oil exports, which once accounted for 95% of the country's revenue. The Maduro government's response has been to deepen ties with America's. Russia has sent Wagner Group mercenaries to train Venezuelan forces, Iran has supplied drones and oil refining technology, and China has become Venezuela's largest creditor, with over $60 billion in loans secured by oil shipments. In 2022, Maduro even hosted a Russian nuclear-capable bomber at an airbase near Caracas, a move that prompted a rare joint statement from the US, Canada, and the UK condemning destabilizing foreign military activity in the region. The media narrative follows this script closely. CNN and the New York Times frame Venezuela as a cautionary tale about the dangers of populism and authoritarianism, while Fox News and the Wall Street Journal warn of a new Cuba on America's doorstep, complete with Russian and Chinese bases. Even the more nuanced coverage, like The Economist's occasional deep dives, tends to focus on the humanitarian crisis or the geopolitical chess moves, treating Venezuela as a pawn in a larger game rather than a player in its own right. But here's the problem with this: it's a caricature. It reduces Venezuela to a one-dimensional villain, a rogue state that must be contained or overthrown, without ever asking why Maduro has survived for over a decade despite economic collapse, international isolation, and multiple US-backed coup attempts. It ignores the fact that Venezuela's crisis is as much a product of US policy as it is of Maduro's mismanagement. And most dangerously, it assumes that the US can continue to squeeze Venezuela indefinitely without triggering a response that could escalate into something far worse than a regional crisis. The data doesn't support this. Let's start with the sanctions. The US has imposed over 400 sanctions on Venezuela since 2017, including secondary sanctions that penalize third-country commies for doing business with Caracas. The stated goal was to force Maduro from power by starving his regime of revenue. But the results have been the opposite of what was intended. Venezuela's oil production did collapse from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1998 to just 700,000 today, but Maduro didn't fall. Instead, he pivoted to Russia and China, who were happy to buy Venezuelan oil at a discount and provide the regime with the financial lifelines it needed to survive. The sanctions also accelerated Venezuela's economic collapse, but rather than turning the population against Maduro, they created a black market economy that the regime controls through corruption and patronage. The poorest Venezuelans suffer the most, but the military and the ruling elite have adapted, using smuggling, gold mining, and cryptocurrency to bypass U.S. restrictions. Then there's the question of legitimacy. The US and its allies have spent years insisting that Maduro's government is illegitimate, but here's the inconvenient: Maduro still controls the military, the courts, and the state apparatus. He won re-election in 2024 in a vote that was neither free nor fair, but also not the complete sham that the US claimed it would be. The opposition is fractured, with some factions boycotting the election and others participating in it. The US recognized Edmundo Gonzalez as the winner, but Maduro's government has refused to step down, and the military has backed him. This isn't a stalemate, it's a slow-motion collapse of US policy. But the real problem with the official narrative is that it ignores the geopolitical con. Venezuela isn't just a failed state, it's a battleground in a new Cold War, one where the rules are being rewritten in real time. The US sees Venezuela as a threat because it's aligned with Russia and China, but that alignment isn't ideological, it's transactional. Maduro isn't a communist, he's a survivor. He'll take money and weapons from anyone who offers them, and right now, that's Moscow and Beijing. The US has tried to isolate Venezuela, but all it's done is push Maduro into the arms of America's adversaries. And that's where the trap lies. What's really happening in Venezuela is a classic case of what I call geopolitical blowback. The US has spent the last 2 decades trying to reshape the world in its image, using a combination of military force, economic coercion, and regime change operations to remove leaders it doesn't like and install ones it does. The results have been: Iraq is a failed state, Afghanistan is back under Taliban rule, Libya is a warlord-run hellscape, and Syria is a Russian-Iranian client. Venezuela was supposed to be different, a quick, bloodless regime change that would restore democracy and secure America's energy interests. But it hasn't worked out that way. Let me tell you why. First, Venezuela isn't Iraq or Libya. It's not a weak state that can be easily overthrown. It has a functioning military, a loyal security apparatus, and a population that, while suffering, still remembers the relative stability of the Chavez years. The US has tried to topple Maduro before, through sanctions, through the 2019 coup attempt, through the 2020 Bay of Piglets fiasco, but every time, Maduro has survived. Why? Because he's not just a dictator, he's a survivor who understands the rules of the game. He knows that the US doesn't want a full-scale war in South America, so he's willing to escalate just enough to keep Washington off balance. Second, Venezuela has powerful friends. Russia and China aren't just backing Maduro out of ideological solidarity, they're doing it because it's in their strategic interest. For Russia, Venezuela is a way to project power into America's backyard, to force the US to divert resources and attention away from Ukraine and the Middle East. For China, Venezuela is a critical source of oil and a foothold in the Western Hemisphere, a region where Beijing is rapidly extending its influence. Both countries have invested billions in Venezuela, and they're not going to let the US push them out without a fight. Third, and most importantly, Venezuela is sitting on the largest oil reserves in the world, 303 billion barrels, more than Saudi Arabia. That's not just a statistic, it's a geopolitical reality. The US has spent the last century ensuring that no single power controls the global oil supply, and Venezuela is the last major oil producer outside of America's sphere of influence. If Maduro falls, the US gets to decide who controls that oil. If he stays, Russia and China get a say. That's why this isn't just about democracy or human rights, it's about who gets to shape the 21st century. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The US has been trying to force Maduro out for years, but every time it gets close, something happens to derail the plan. In 2019, it was the failed coup. In 2020, it was the botched mercenary invasion. In 2023, it was the sudden thaw in U.S.-Venezuela relations when the Biden administration temporarily lifted sanctions in exchange for Maduro's promise to hold free elections. That deal fell apart when Maduro arrested opposition leaders and banned the main opposition candidate from running, but the fact that the U.S. was even negotiating with him shows how desperate Washington is to avoid a direct confrontation. But here's the: Maduro isn't just playing defense. He's setting a trap. And the U.S. is walking right into it. To understand how this trap works, you need to step back and look at the bigger picture. The world is in the middle of a fundamental shift, one that's been building for decades but has accelerated since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The unipolar moment, the brief period after the Cold War when the U.S. was the world's sole superpower, is over. What's emerging in its place is a multipolar order, one where power is distributed among multiple: the US, China, Russia, and eventually India, the EU, and perhaps even a resurgent Middle East. This isn't just a theoretical debate, it's the defining geopolitical reality of our time. The US has responded to this shift by doubling down on its traditional maintaining global hegemony through military dominance, economic coercion, and regime change. The problem is that this strategy is no longer sustainable. The US is overstretched, its alliances are fraying, and its adversaries are getting stronger. China is building a parallel financial system, Russia is waging a shadow war in Europe, and the global south is increasingly resistant to US pressure. The US can still project power, but it can no longer dictate the terms of the international order. Venezuela is a perfect example of this dynamic. The US sees Maduro as a problem to be solved, but from Moscow and Beijing's perspective, he's an asset to be protected. Every time the US tries to remove him, it strengthens their hand. If the US invades, Russia and China will respond, not directly, but by escalating in other theaters, like Taiwan or Ukraine. If the US imposes more sanctions, they'll step in with financial aid and military support. And if the US tries to negotiate, they'll demand concessions that undermine America's position. This is the trap. The US can't afford to let Maduro stay in power, because that would signal weakness and encourage other adversaries. But it also can't afford to remove him, because that would trigger a response from Russia and China that could spiral out of control. The result is a policy of perpetual pressure, sanctions, diplomatic isolation, covert operations that keeps Venezuela in a state of crisis but never quite pushes it over the edge. It's a strategy of exhaustion, and it's not working. Let me be: this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the future of US power. The US has spent the last 2 decades trying to maintain its dominance through force, and it's failed. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, none of these wars achieved their objectives, and all of them weakened America's position. Venezuela is the next front in this struggle, and if the US isn't careful, it could be the one that breaks the camel's back. So what happens next? Let's look at the military and strategic implications. The US has been slowly escalating its military presence in the region. In 2023, the Pentagon deployed a carrier strike group to the Caribbean for the first time in years, ostensibly for routine exercises but clearly intended as a show of force. The US has also increased its military aid to Guyana, which has been locked in a tense standoff with Venezuela over the Essequibo region. In February of this year, the US and Guyana held joint military exercises, including a live-fire drill near the disputed border. Venezuela responded by holding its own military exercises, including a simulated amphibious invasion of Essequibo. Now, the US has a few options. It could launch a limited strike against Venezuelan military targets, as it did in Syria in 2017 and 2018. It could impose a naval blockade, cutting off Venezuela's oil exports and starving the regime of revenue. Or it could try another coup, this time with better planning and execution. But all of these options come with serious risks. First, there's the risk of escalation. Venezuela isn't Syria or Libya. It has a real military, with Russian and Iranian advisors, and it's not afraid to use it. If the US strikes Venezuelan targets, Maduro could respond by attacking US assets in the region, like the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base in Cuba or the US Embassy in Caracas. He could also escalate in other theaters, like Ukraine or the South China Sea, by providing Russia and China with intelligence or weapons. Second, there's the risk of blowback. The US has tried regime change in Venezuela before, and it's never gone well. The 2002 coup against Chavez failed, the 2019 coup against Maduro failed, and the 2020 mercenary invasion failed. Every time the US tries to remove Maduro, it strengthens his position at home and abroad. The Venezuelan military is loyal to Maduro because they know that if he falls, they'll be purged or prosecuted. The opposition is divided and weak, and the population is exhausted. A US intervention would unite them against a common America. Third, there's the risk of a wider war. If the US invades Venezuela, Russia and China won't sit on the sidelines. They'll respond in ways that force the US to divert resources and attention away from other theaters. Russia could escalate in Ukraine, China could move on Taiwan, and Iran could step up its attacks on US forces in the Middle East. The US would find itself fighting a multi-front war, with no clear path to victory. Now, let me tell you something that the hawks in Washington don't want you to. There is no quick and easy solution to the Venezuela problem. The US can't just bomb its way to victory, and it can't impose democracy at the point of a gun. The lessons of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya are regime change is messy, expensive, and unpredictable. The US has spent trillions of dollars and thousands of lives trying to reshape the Middle East, and it's failed. Why would Venezuela be any different? But here's the hawks don't care about the lessons of history. They see Venezuela as a low-cost, high-reward opportunity, a chance to remove a hostile regime and secure America's energy interests without committing to a full-scale war. They're wrong. Venezuela is a trap, and the US is walking right into it. The domestic political dimension is just as important as the geopolitical one. Venezuela has become a partisan issue in the US, with Republicans accusing the Biden administration of being soft on Maduro and Democrats warning of the dangers of military intervention. This isn't just about ideology, it's about politics. Florida is a swing state, and Venezuelan Americans are a key voting bloc. Both parties are trying to appeal to them, which means neither side has an incentive to pursue a realistic policy. The Trump administration took a hard line on Venezuela, imposing sanctions and recognizing Guaido as the legitimate president. The Biden administration has walked back some of those policies, lifting sanctions in exchange for Maduro's promise to hold free elections, but it's also maintained the overall framework of regime change. The result is a policy that's neither fish nor fowl, too aggressive to be effective, but not aggressive enough to achieve its objectives. The key players in the administration are divided. On one side, you have the realists, like Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who understand the risks of escalation and want to pursue a diplomatic solution. On the other side, you have the hawks, like National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who see Venezuela as a strategic threat that must be neutralized. The problem is that neither side has a coherent strategy. The realists don't want to use force, but they also don't want to lift sanctions, which means they're stuck in a policy of perpetual pressure. The hawks want to use force, but they don't have a plan for what comes next, which means they're advocating for a war without a clear endgame. The result is a policy that satisfies no one. The Venezuelan opposition is frustrated because the US isn't doing enough to remove Maduro. The military is frustrated because the US isn't doing enough to support them. And the American public is frustrated because they don't understand why the US is still involved in Venezuela after 2 decades of failed interventions in Latin America. The irony is that the more the US doubles down on its Venezuela policy, the more it undermines its own strategic position not just in Caracas, but across the hemisphere. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela isn't just a domestic political football in the US, it's a proxy battleground for a much larger geopolitical struggle. The country sits at the intersection of 3 critical: the Caribbean, the Andes, and the Amazon. Control Venezuela, and you control the maritime choke points that connect the Atlantic to the AMA Canal. You control the cocaine routes that fund insurgencies from Colombia to Mexico. And you control the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, reserves that, in a world where energy security is once again a national priority, could shift the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere. This is why Russia, China, and Iran have all dug in their heels in Venezuela. Moscow sees Maduro as a useful irritant to Washington, a way to keep the US distracted while it consolidates its position in Ukraine and the Middle East. Since 2006, Russia has sold Venezuela over $11 billion in arms, including Sukhoi fighter jets, T-72 tanks, and S-300 air defense systems. In 2019, after the US recognized Guaido, Russia sent in Wagner Group mercenaries not to prop up Maduro, but to protect Rosneft's oil interests. When the US sanctioned Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, in 2019, Russia's Rosneft stepped in as the middleman, buying Venezuelan crude at a discount and reselling it to Asia. That's not charity, that's strategic leverage. China, meanwhile, has turned Venezuela into a testing ground for its debt trap diplomacy. Between 2007 and 2018, Beijing loaned Caracas over $62 billion, more than any other country in Latin America. Most of that money was squandered on white elephant infrastructure projects or stolen by regime insiders, but the debt remains. Today, Venezuela repays China not in cash, but in oil, shipping over 300,000 barrels per day to Chinese refineries. That's oil that could otherwise go to US allies in the region, or to global markets at a time when prices are volatile. And let's not forget the military. In 2021, China delivered a batch of FN-6 man-portable air defense systems to Venezuela, the same type used by Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and Syria. The message is if the US tries to intervene militarily, it won't just be fighting Maduro's forces, it'll be fighting a network of proxies armed by America's two biggest adversaries. Then there's Iran, which has turned Venezuela into a forward operating base in the Western Hemisphere. Since 2020, Iran's Mahan Air has operated direct flights between Tehran and Caracas, ferrying Quds Force operatives, weapons, and even drones. In 2022, the US seized a shipment of Iranian missiles bound for Venezuela, including precision-guided ballistic missiles that could threaten US bases in Colombia or the Dutch island of Curaçao. The Iranians aren't just selling weapons, they're helping Venezuela build its own drone program. In 2023, Maduro unveiled the Arpia, a Venezuelan-made drone modeled after Iran's Mohajer 6, capable of carrying out surveillance and light strike missions. This isn't just about Venezuela, it's about creating a new axis of resistance in America's backyard. Here's the uncomfortable: the US has no coherent response to this multi-front challenge because it's still operating under the assumption that Venezuela is a problem to be solved, rather than a symptom of a larger shift in global power. The Pentagon's 2022 National Defense Strategy identified China as the pacing challenge and Russia as an acute threat, but it barely mentions Latin America. That's a mistake. The region is the soft underbelly of US hegemony, and Venezuela is the weakest link in the chain. If the US can't stabilize Venezuela, it can't secure its southern flank. And if it can't secure its southern flank, it can't focus on the Indo-Pacific or Europe. Let me explain why this matters for the military balance. The U.S. Southern Command, or SOUTHCOM, is responsible for defending the hemisphere from external threats. But SOUTHCOM is the most underfunded and overstretched combatant command in the U.S. military. Its budget is a fraction of what's allocated to Indo-Pacific Command or European Command. Its forces are spread thin, with only a handful of ships and aircraft to monitor an area that SS 31 countries and 16 million square miles. In 2021, SOUTHCOM's commander, Admiral Craig Fowler, warned Congress that the U.S. was losing its competitive edge in the region due to Chinese and Russian influence. His successor, General Laura Richardson, has said the same thing, but her warnings have fallen on deaf ears. The problem isn't just resources, it's doctrine. The U.S. military is still optimized for large-scale conventional wars, not the kind of hybrid warfare being waged in Venezuela. When I talk to officers at SOUTHCOM, they'll tell you that the real threat isn't a Russian tank column rolling into Caracas, it's the slow, steady erosion of U.S. influence through economic coercion, cyber attacks, and proxy networks. In 2020, for example, a cyber attack knocked out Venezuela's power grid for days, plunging much of the country into darkness. Maduro blamed the U.S., but the fingerprints pointed to Russia's GRU. That's the new: not tanks and troops, but energy grids, financial systems, and information networks. The US has tried to counter this with sanctions, but sanctions alone don't work. They didn't topple Maduro, and they won't deter Russia or China. In fact, they've had the opposite: they've pushed Venezuela deeper into the arms of America's adversaries. The US has also tried covert action, but that's a double-edged sword. In 2020, the Trump administration reportedly greenlit a botched mercenary operation to capture Maduro, known as Operation Gideon. The plan was a disaster. Most of the operatives were captured or killed within hours, and it handed Maduro a propaganda victory, allowing him to portray himself as the victim of US imperialism. That's the problem with covert. When it fails, it doesn't just fail, it backfires. So where does that leave us? The US has three options, none of them good. The first is to double down on regime change, either through military intervention or a coup. But as we've seen in Iraq and Libya, regime change is the easy part, the hard part is what comes after. Venezuela isn't Iraq, it's a country with deep institutional rot, a collapsed economy, and a population that's been traumatized by 2 decades of Chavismo. Even if Maduro were removed tomorrow, the country would still be a failed state, and the US would be on the hook for rebuilding it. That's a commitment no American president is willing to make. The second option is to negotiate a power-sharing deal, where Maduro steps down in exchange for sanctions relief and a transition to democracy. The Biden administration has tried this, but it's a non-starter for Maduro. He knows that if he gives up power, he'll end up in The Hague or in a Miami courtroom facing drug trafficking charges. The only way he'll negotiate is if he's given ironclad guarantees of immunity, and that's something no US president can credibly offer. Even if they could, the Venezuelan opposition is too fractured to govern. Guaido's interim government was a fiction from the start, a Potemkin village of exiles and dissidents with no real power on the ground. The military, meanwhile, is deeply corrupt and has no interest in democracy. They'll back Maduro as long as he keeps the money flowing. The third option is the most realistic, but also the most containment. The US could accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere and focus on limiting the damage. That means working with regional allies like Colombia and Brazil to counter Russian and Chinese influence, securing the border to prevent the spillover of instability, and using targeted sanctions to squeeze the regime's finances without starving the population. It's not a solution, it's damage control. But in a world where the US is stretched thin, damage control might be the best we can hope for. The problem is that containment requires patience, and patience is in short supply in Washington. Every 4 years, the political winds shift, and Venezuela policy gets thrown out the window. The Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign gave way to the Biden administration's half-hearted diplomacy, which will likely give way to whatever the next administration decides to do. That kind of inconsistency is a gift to Maduro and his backers in Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran. They don't need to win, they just need to outlast the US. Here's the bottom: Venezuela is a strategic trap because it exposes the limits of American power. The US can't fix Venezuela, but it can't ignore it either. The longer it stays stuck in this quagmire, the more it emboldens its adversaries and weakens its own position. The question isn't whether the US will get out of Venezuela, it's whether it can afford to stay in. And right now, the answer isn't clear. Now, what most people don't realize is that this strategic paralysis isn't just about Washington's short attention or the opposition's incompetence, it's baked into Venezuela's domestic political reality. The country isn't just a failed state, it's a hollowed-out state, where the institutions that once gave it stability have been repurposed into tools of control. The military, the courts, even the Electoral Council, none of them function as they should, because they were never designed to. They were designed to keep Maduro in power, and that's exactly what they do. Take the 2024 presidential election, for example. The regime didn't just rig it, they perfected the art of electoral fraud. Not in the crude way of stuffing ballot boxes or burning votes, but by systematically dismantling any mechanism that could challenge them. They banned Maria Corina Machado, the opposition's most popular candidate, on flimsy legal grounds. They disqualified her replacement, Corina Yoris, at the last minute. They allowed only a handful of opposition figures to run, all of them pre-approved by the regime. And when the votes were counted, the National Electoral Council, controlled by Maduro loyalists, declared him the winner with 51% of the vote, despite independent exit polls showing him losing by double digits. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro didn't win that election. He didn't even need to win it. The point wasn't to convince anyone he had legitimacy, it was to demonstrate that legitimacy no longer matters. The regime has spent the last decade eroding the very idea of a fair contest, not just in practice but in principle. The opposition can scream fraud all they want, but without a credible alternative, without a unified leadership, a coherent plan, or even a basic strategy for governing, their protests ring hollow. And that's exactly how Maduro likes it. Let me explain why this matters. The opposition's fragmentation isn't an accident, it's a feature of the regime's survival strategy. Maduro doesn't just repress his enemies, he divides them. He lets them bicker among themselves, lets them splinter into factions, lets them waste energy on infighting while he consolidates power. Look at the mess after the 2015 parliamentary elections, when the opposition won a supermajority in the National Assembly. Within months, Maduro had the Supreme Court, packed with his allies, strip the legislature of its powers. The opposition responded by some wanted to negotiate, others wanted to escalate, and a few even flirted with the idea of a military coup. By the time they got their act together, it was too late. The moment had passed. The same pattern played out in 2019, when Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president. For a brief moment, it looked like the opposition had finally united behind a single figure. The US and more than 50 other countries recognized him as Venezuela's legitimate leader. But Guaidó never controlled the military, never controlled the courts, and never controlled the streets. His government was a legal fiction, a diplomatic stunt with no real authority. And when the regime cracked down, arresting his allies, blocking his access to funds, even trying to assassinate him, he had no way to fight back. The opposition's unity was always fragile, and Maduro knew exactly how to exploit that. Now, in 2025, the opposition is more divided than ever. Machado, the woman who won the opposition's primary with 92% of the vote, is still banned from running. The coalition that backed her, the Plataforma Unitaria, is in shambles, with some factions pushing for dialogue with the regime and others calling for mass protests. The younger generation of activists, the ones who took to the streets in 2017 and 2019, are exhausted and disillusioned. Many have left the country. Others have given up on politics entirely. And the ones who remain are often the most radical, the ones who see negotiation as surrender. This is the trap. The opposition can't govern because it can't unite, and it can't unite because the regime won't let it. Maduro doesn't need to crush them outright, he just needs to keep them weak, keep them fighting each other, keep them from ever presenting a real alternative. And as long as that's the case, the US and its allies are stuck in the same imposed sanctions, demand elections, watch the regime ignore them, repeat. But here's where it gets even more complicated. The opposition isn't just divided, it's discredited. After years of failed strategies, empty promises, and infighting, many Venezuelans have simply stopped believing in it. Polls show that while most people still oppose Maduro, they don't trust the opposition to do any better. That's a devastating indictment, but it's also a reality. The opposition's biggest failure isn't that it lost, it's that it never offered a vision for what comes in. It spent so much time trying to remove Maduro that it forgot to explain how it would rebuild the country. And that's the other side of the coin. Even if the opposition somehow united behind a single leader, even if they won an election, even if the military suddenly decided to switch sides, what then? Venezuela isn't just a country with a bad government, it's a country with a broken economy, a collapsed infrastructure, and a population that's been traumatized by years of hyperinflation, blackouts, and repression. Rebuilding it would take decades, billions of dollars, and a level of political stability that Venezuela hasn't seen in years. The regime knows this. That's why they're not afraid of the opposition. They're not afraid of the US. They're not even afraid of sanctions. What they're afraid of is the day the money runs out. Venezuela's economy is a house of cards, propped up by oil revenues, Chinese loans, and Russian arms deals. But oil production has collapsed from 3.5 million barrels a day in 1998 to barely 700,000 today. The refineries are falling apart. The pipelines are rusting. And the regime's only response has been to print more money, driving inflation to levels that make Zimbabwe look stable. So what happens when the oil money dries up? What happens when the Chinese stop lending and the Russians stop propping up the bolivar? That's the scenario that keeps Maduro up at night. Not the opposition. Not the US. The day the regime can't pay the generals, the day the military realizes they're better off without him, that's the real threat. And that's why the most likely scenario for Venezuela isn't a sudden democratic transition or a US-backed coup. It's slow-motion collapse. The regime will limp along, clinging to power through repression and corruption, while the economy continues to deteriorate. The opposition will remain fractured, unable to offer a real alternative. The US will keep imposing sanctions, but they'll have less and less effect as the regime finds new ways to evade them. And the Venezuelan people will keep suffering, caught between a government that doesn't care about them and an opposition that can't help them. The only question is how long this can last. Venezuela isn't Cuba, it's not a small island with a single-party system and a population that's learned to live with scarcity. It's a large, resource-rich country with a young, urban population that's used to a certain standard of living. The longer the crisis drags on, the harder it will be for the regime to contain the unrest. The military might hold together for now, but what happens when the soldiers' families can't afford food? What happens when the generals start looking for an exit strategy? That's the wild card. Not the opposition. Not the US. The military. Because in the end, that's the only thing that matters in Venezuela. The generals decide who rules, and right now, they're still backing Maduro. But their loyalty isn't absolute. It's transactional. And when the transactions stop, so does the loyalty. So here's my Venezuela will muddle through for the next few years, with the regime tightening its grip and the opposition flailing. The US will keep trying to contain the damage, but it won't have the patience or the resources to do much more. The regional allies Colombia, Brazil, even Mexico will try to mediate, but they won't have the leverage to force real change. And the Venezuelan people will keep leaving, in the millions, creating a refugee crisis that will destabilize the entire region. The only thing that could change this trajectory is a shock and economic collapse so severe that even the military can't ignore it, or a split in the regime's inner circle that forces Maduro out. But even then, the most likely outcome isn't democracy. It's a new strongman, another general, another cycle of repression. Because that's the lesson Venezuela has taught us over and over: when a country's institutions are this broken, the only thing that replaces a dictator is another dictator. And that's the real tragedy. Venezuela wasn't always like this. It was once a stable democracy, a prosperous country, a regional leader. It had problems, sure, but it wasn't a failed state. It became one because of bad decisions, yes, but also because of bad luck, because of external pressures, because of the curse of oil. And now, after 2 decades of Chavismo, after years of mismanagement and corruption, it's hard to see a way back. The US can't fix this. Neither can the opposition. The best anyone can hope for is damage control, keeping the crisis from spilling over, preventing a complete collapse, maybe even nudging the regime towards some kind of managed transition. But that's not a solution. It's a band-aid on a gaping wound. And that's why Venezuela is such a strategic trap. Because it forces us to confront the limits of our power, the fragility of our alliances, and the reality that some problems don't have good solutions, only bad ones and worse ones. The question isn't whether we can save Venezuela. It's whether we can live with the consequences of not saving it. And right now, I'm not sure we can.